Hello. I'm grateful for the invitation from our friends and partners at NetLogistic to review how we've used gains, and particularly what we call sales, inventory, and operations planning to manage through an evolving and in many cases volatile business environment with which we're having to contend over the last few quarters. And next couple, and hopefully that's all, but there's going to be, I think, some volatility in both directions, entering, managing the new equilibrium, and then exiting in 2021. So we want to share some of that with you today through the following slides. The next thing that I want to mention is putting this into context, which is the gains solution overall. So we've used what we call sales, inventory, and operations planning as an effective tool to handle the volatile events of late, as mentioned, but we also have core functions that interact with this and are key in assisting managing demand planning and forecasting, inventory optimization, and how those goals need to change in light of volatile events, your replenishing or production optimization, that includes buying and manufacturing, and then how all of these are linked together through sales, inventory, and operations planning. So very briefly, gains is a solution that's evolved over our work with 500 organizations and over 15 what we call battle-tested versions. Our belief is that this problem cannot be completely solved, and so we continue getting closer to optimum and understanding that real-life heuristics need to be applied as well to provide completely automated results that are feasible to implement. We step forward a little bit. So some of the fundamentals that we talked about with our customers and partners trying to manage demand shifts, and we've had a variety of different scenarios that our customers have faced. Some of them, like home improvement retailers, actually saw a surge of demand and very large surges in certain product categories. Others that say worked in areas related to commercial aviation, obviously have seen steep, hopefully short-lived declines in demand. And others have seen relatively significant, but not precipitous or really large declines in demand, and are seeing some equilibrium. And then some people are seeing some recovery as certain areas tend to increase, say, those things around automotive where people are starting to drive more frequently, and we're seeing, say, greater use of service parts for our customer Honda Motors, for example. So we've really had a variety of experiences, but what most people have seen, vast majority, has been significant changes from trend, whether that trend was up, down, or level. And what we've done in a few areas here is in demand planning, we've helped with some rapid and aggregate, meaning at a high level, forecast adjustments, managed with history adjustments as well. A lot of those have been around customer level demand analysis. So trying to understand which customers going 2 levels down have seen a demand decline that might be affecting them, or demand increase. We do work with healthcare, for example, so a lot of those customers have seen surges. And managing that as well, so looking at customer level demand and including or augmenting that historically to drive forecasts, affecting forecasts themselves, and then also looking at outlier thresholds, meaning where do we want to consider certain events as extreme, and those are changing across time, so we could fine tune that as well. Moving into sort of phase 2 of things that we're doing to help adjust to the volatility, entering equilibrium or exiting, is adjusting service levels. For those markets where demand has declined or increased a lot, customers are more willing to wait. And so how can you manage that? Secondarily, when we talk about carrying and receiving costs, we also have certain opportunities to consolidate inventory. So if you have multiple locations and or multiple levels in your supply chain, how can you consolidate, say, reduce inventory by attrition at certain lower levels or certain outlying locations, and consolidate that to reduce working capital if that's constrained during this period. And then lastly, some other heuristic constraints to minimize budget expenditures, like managing lower purchase sizes than you typically would have had for an cost optimal under normal conditions. In replenishment planning, we've done a lot to basically fine-tune open order management. What can be deferred, what can be canceled? How can we do that in a way that assures our suppliers stay healthy? So not just shredding every third invoice or PO, but also doing it in a way that level loads the pain across suppliers if you're trying to reduce them. Or conversely, if your demand's growing, how do you preemptively place orders or manage orders, knowing that their lead times are going to extend as their capacity is constrained? And those two dynamics also affect inventory sharing. How do you redistribute when you're trying to reduce overall inventory? And then how do you redistribute when things are scarce and demand's increasing? Same with distribution allocation. So the extent that you're in a current shortage period, how do you allocate that optimally to minimize total stock out risk? And then as you're coming out and demand is high and there's capacity constraints from your supplier, you'll probably have shortage. How do you allocate optimally under those conditions? And then phase 4, we've worked with several customers to try to use this event and challenge as a way to accelerate multi-enterprise planning. So we have something called the Supply Chain Optimization Network that allows suppliers, their customers and their customers' customers to all connect in one data network for both demand and supply sensing analysis. So these are some of the methods that we might call fundamental or pre-SI&OP means of managing the demand shifts either direction. So stepping into the sort of the main topic of the presentation, sales inventory and operations planning, let me define that and describe that solution a bit. So the general approach here is what's called scenario planning, which is creating not just the plan, but creating several plans around different sets of assumptions, which might include things like having low, moderate, or high demand, and or seeing changes in demand that take effect quickly, moderately, or slowly. So we'll talk a bit about that and how that's fully integrated across demand planning, supply, and inventory. This idea of a consensus demand plan that includes different parts of the organization, marketing, sales, operations, so that informal data like customer sentiment can be incorporated into the plan quickly, even if it hasn't yet become observable in sales history. And then workflow management across the organization. Additionally, I mentioned scenario planning and how we can run simulations to help understand the impacts and help understand how to be ready for different scenarios. I'll step now into a few of the other underlying concepts. So one is, why did we focus here? And what we've seen from the research, and this is by Supply Chain Insights, who's led by a well-known analyst named Laura Cesari. If you're familiar with her, she's excellent. And actually speaking at our GAINS conference here shortly. What she pointed out is that the largest gap between need, so in this case, 70% of those major supply chain organizations surveyed said that what if analyses and assessing alternatives was a major need, very important. And how well did they do it? in which case only 31% felt that they were operating at a high level. That gap of 39% was the single largest gap from amongst these key areas. So this sort of underlined our focus on this element in particular. The construct within GAINS for scenario planning is shown here. There are really 4 key sections. One foundational section, the retrieval component, helps define the population of parts or products or items that you would want to include in the scenario analysis. That could be organization-wide, or it could be some subset of key items. Within that subset, you can then create scenario groupings, which will give you your breadth of scenarios. In this case, these are regional, so it's one group of products in this example, and looking at the impact across different regions like North America and Asia Pacific. It could be the same region across different levels of demand, like low, medium, and high. So there's any number of ways to architect the different scenarios. Within these, you can create those key performance indicator metrics, or these different index values that you'd like to compare across scenarios. So in this case, we had 5 scenarios, and we were comparing elements like differences in gross margin and differences in inventory, differences in inventory turns. Other common metrics we see are purchase budget required and or capacity plans for your manufacturing, et cetera. Any number of these can be included and then contrasted across the different scenarios, each of which has a journaling concept where you can keep notes across those scenarios. I will also offer something not mentioned here, which is we've recently integrated this with Microsoft Teams, where you can create a team channel across these scenarios and fully integrate with single click between these scenarios and a related team channel, and vice versa. In your Teams channel, you can link to scenario planning dashboard, and in that dialog, a single click can bring you into the scenario, the related scenario planning details here. So just sort of a interesting side note for those of you using Teams. A lot of our, I'd say, majority of our customers have begun using that in the last couple of quarters. Moving on back to the screen. Within the scenario detail pop-up, we can then get quick views into any of the detailed elements underlying the differences between different scenarios by metric. So let me talk a bit about how you can define the differences in the parameters in each scenario. So in slide 8 here, we talk about the forecast summary and simulation mode. What we have here is the ability to enable these GAINS screens. And for those of you familiar with GAINS, you can see that the background colors have been altered, indicating that the changes you're making are not affecting the production system, but are affecting just this one particular scenario that's being assembled. And in this case, we're looking at different divisions within an overall organization and making demand plan changes for that. As you might see as you're trying to evaluate low, medium, high, or slow, moderate, and fast changes in demand. And these can all be done at a very high level, even corporation or organization wide. And then those impacts are included in the results for that particular scenario. Another key function that's typically varied across scenarios or changed across scenarios is capacity planning. So the extent that you want to look at both what capacity plan changes are needed or what your constrained sales would be given different capacities. Let's say if you opted to reduce overtime or add a line at a future date or decommission a production line. So depending on which way your demand's going, you can make those changes in capacity, and that will be utilized in the scenario planning function. In this case, you can see, for example, there's a tree map that's indicating which particular production lines will be at risk in that scenario and how important they are to overall revenue. So the bigger the square, the larger the revenue impact, and the more red the color, the greater the prospective lost revenue or revenue at risk. So this is another common simulation variable. In the scenario details pop-up, this is a way to customize what kind of details you'd like to see around each particular KPI, whether that's working capital or inventory, et cetera, or demand over time. And these are quite configurable and also allow very simple export to Excel for other types of offline analysis. Continuing on, I think, and in summary, I wanted to note some of the business impacts here. First is prior to demand recovery and then following demand recovery. So we'll break this into two parts. Within prior to demand recovery, we focus on rapidly reducing inbound supply via customer level approach and conserving potentially scarce working capital. So we look at both reducing surplus inventory, but also, as I mentioned earlier, not reiterated on this slide, is making sure that you partner with your suppliers to provide enough business to keep them viable when demand does recover. In addition to sort of managing the detailed demand and supply, there's also stocking policies and optimizing deployment, as we discussed earlier. And then following demand recovery, how can we reactivate customers at that customer level and then optimize redeployment? So if scarcity is occurring because supplier lead times are extending and inventory is scarce in that interim period, how do we redeploy that for the least stock out risk approach? And then secondly, how do we maximize service levels with dynamic supply planning, as we mentioned, managing around likely extended lead times and allocation? And how do we use underlying all of this, the sales, inventory, and operations planning to simulate these events before they happen? Obviously, the prior to demand recovery is probably in the rearview mirror, but as we talk about demand recovery, how do we simulate what's needed there so that we can capture any lost market share and hopefully build and increase market share by being better prepared than competitors? So I wanted to thank you for your time today, and immediately following this presentation will be a question and answer period. Thank you very much.